All right, I'm Doug Trum, Executive Director at the Urbanist, and thank you all for joining us for our monthly meetup. We're excited to host Nikkita Oliver this month, and you're all pretty familiar, but I'll do a quick intro. Nikkita Oliver, who uses they, them pronouns, is a community organizer, cultural worker, artist, attorney, and executive director at the youth diversion program, Creative Justice. They are running for city council in position 9. They are fresh off a first place primary finish this last month, and they have endorsements from the Stranger, MLK Labor Council, and the Urbanist Election Committee. They ran for mayor in 2017 with the Seattle People's Party and finished 3rd in the primary. And they continue to organize and advocate since, including with defund SPD efforts that Decriminalize Seattle and King County Equity Now spearheaded, bringing together a broader solidarity budget coalition to help win a 18% reduction to the Seattle Police Department's budget. And that makes Seattle one of the few cities to pass a significant decrease to the police budget after a summer of police brutality and defiance. The Oliver campaign has championed many urbanist causes, from social housing, ending exclusionary zoning, stopping the encampment sweeps, free transit, and environmental justice, and the Green New Deal. And I'll briefly quote the election committee and their endorsement write-up. We genuinely think Nikkita Oliver is a visionary of the kind that could transform our city's politics permanently and for the better, by articulating a clear moral vision of a progressive future and then doing the hard organizing work that gets it done. Now the general election's ahead of us, and we will see how that shakes out. But with a coalition like that behind, we're very optimistic. And I'll pass it over to Nikkita, who can give a introduction. And you're still muted, Nikkita.
Sorry, y'all. I am I'm balancing responsibilities at work right now unexpectedly. The joys of being a full-time executive director and candidate in the middle of a pandemic, navigating, making sure all of our staff can take time off when they need it. So yes, I am here in this. My name is Nikkita Oliver. I use they, them pronouns, and really honored to be in the general election and to be endorsed by the Urbanist. Really just reflecting on the last few years, thinking about the election in 2017 and how different a world it is, and yet how disturbingly similar it is to the problems we were facing then, and how gravely exacerbated all of the many crises are. And at the same time, hopefully finding for each of us a bit of hope and the opportunity to do something drastically different and transformational, and to make strides of addressing these crises at their root rather than continuing to respond to symptoms. As a campaign, much of the big things that we have been talking about have been housing affordability, getting our residents without homes into homes with permanent supportive services, addressing the crisis around density. It is worth noting that the Seattle comprehensive plan first went into place in 1923 and was informed by a man by the name of Harlan Bartholomew, who was a known segregationist. And when we look at where things are in 2021, it should be no surprise that since we haven't done the hard work of transforming that zoning plan for it to be racially and economically equitable, that in 2021, we're not only seeing an extreme housing crisis, but in my opinion, a very segregated city both economically and in terms of land use and zoning policy, and in terms of access to affordable housing. And so I'm really excited about the opportunity to think deeply about how, as a city, we are addressing the housing affordability crisis, undoing the problematic history of redlining and exclusionary zoning, how density and housing plays into us addressing the climate catastrophe, because we could do all of this work in the next 10 years. And if it's not with the goal of responding effectively and rapidly to the climate crisis in front of us, it won't matter. We could have all the housing in the world, and if it gets too hot or the waters rise too high, we won't be here anyways. And so I see our fight for transportation for all, housing equity, and addressing density and our exclusionary zoning pattern. These are all interconnected solutions that guide us towards addressing the climate catastrophe and ultimately building a city that is more accessible by foot, by bike, by rolling, whatever means you get your body through the city. You're able to do that by having access to sidewalks, curb cutouts, transportation that is rapid and connected throughout the city and is affordable. And I love that I'm probably on a call with a group of people who all share the vision and the passion of having transportation for everyone, a free, equitable, accessible transportation system that is well constructed and hopefully here to last in our city for a long time to get us out of this single occupancy vehicle focus. And ultimately seeing all of these things, whether it's transportation, housing, progressive revenue generation, all being things that lead to a healthier, more thriving city. And doing it, in my opinion, in a way that I hope has practical impact. And by practical impact, I mean changes the material conditions, the lived experience of our most vulnerable and marginalized residents here in Seattle. And so that as we're building policy, those are the people we're first and foremost thinking about. Does this policy have racial equity? Does this policy have economic equity? Does this policy have environmental and climate justice woven into it? Since we know communities like South Park, Rainier Beach, Beacon Hill are some of those that are most deeply impacted today, right now, by the climate catastrophe, a lack of access to equitable transportation, and who are most deeply impacted by the housing crisis. So my goal as a city council member, outside of all those beautiful things I just laid out, is how do we drive our council to think intersectionally, race, class, gender, ability, religion, language, but also intersectionally about the issues, the crisis that we're facing. They are not separated from each other. And I think one of the problems for our city is that we have tried to address the housing crisis, density, transportation, and equity as all these separate issues, but in reality, they're all interconnected, and the solutions are actually interconnected. So how can we as a council be thinking more deeply about building interconnected solutions that get to the root causes of the racial wealth gap or disparities in healthcare, or even the problems of our current criminal punishment system, whose number one goal right now in a lot of ways is to criminalize poverty. If we really look at who is being prosecuted in Seattle Municipal Court, who is most likely to be stopped by Seattle Police Department, who lives in neighborhoods that are over-policed, they are also the same neighborhoods that lack access to healthcare, that lack access to affordable housing. And they're also the same neighborhoods that when we look at our city maps of how our comprehensive plans have unfolded over the last 100 years, they're usually the neighborhoods that have been impacted by exclusionary zoning, redlining, and Seattle's history of racist land practices. So we really have a lot of work in front of us. And I actually think that that is the promise of the moment. We could allow the crisis to drive us into the typical status quo responses, which is what I think Compassion Seattle offered us, or we can do the work that gets us to addressing the underlying root causes and hopefully move ourselves to being the progressive city that we talk about. So I will stop there. And I know we have questions, we'll dig deeper into all of these things, but I'm excited to share space with y'all.
Thank you for that. And I'm just realizing we probably did not set mute as the default when people are entering. So please mute yourselves when you come in. Well, if you're finding yourself unmuted, I'll try to catch people when they're coming in. Apologies for that. And thank you for that lovely introduction. We did get a question I thought related to one of the things you really highlighted, Nikkita, and that's, how do we decarbonize Seattle? That's from John. How do we really get it done? Because it's an aspirational thing for a lot of cities, but not a lot, especially American cities, are getting very far.
Yeah, I mean, we say it's aspirational, but in all honesty, it's practical. It's what has to happen if the city's going to be here in 20, 30, 40 years. I think it's a multifaceted thing. So I'll start first by talking about density. I get a lot of constituent questions about the tree canopy. And often people juxtapose things like having a tree canopy with density, as if the two cannot coexist. But reality is equitably building density throughout our city is probably the best way to protect the tree canopy. It is also the best way to stop urban sprawl. We have to be committed to slowing urban sprawl. We have to be committed to building a city where people can move between home, school, childcare, other amenities like grocery store or healthcare services within a small radius of their home. And there are parts of Seattle that do have access to that benefit, but we have built it in a way that unless you are making wages that allow you to live in a luxury apartment, you probably don't have access to a 15-minute walk city, and probably have very little promise of that ever existing in your neighborhood. And if it does exist in your neighborhood, where I live in Rainier Beach, there are some corridors I would say are probably going to be 15-minute walk areas. Your neighborhood is rapidly gentrifying and you're being displaced. So in addition to density, as we change the zoning code and get rid of single family zoning and move towards neighborhood residential with a lot of opportunity for different types of infill strategies, expanding our urban village and where they exist, aligning that with the transportation system that we're building out, is putting in place anti-displacement and anti-gentrification strategies at the same time. We don't want to, here's one of my biggest fears. We'll get everyone on board with getting rid of single family zoning, but we'll fail to put in the policies that keep people in their neighborhoods. And we'll have a bunch of private developers building density all over the city that is unaffordable to those who we changed the zoning code for in the first place. So really coupling those strategies and thinking about, and this is where thinking about our intersectional planning, and I think the Comprehensive Plan 2024 presents a great opportunity for this, is how are we building accessible, rapid, well-connected transit alongside that density in neighborhoods where people have not had access to it? And are we considering where our workers live? Those who are not in the tech industry and may not have the opportunity to work from home, those who do have to travel, are we providing access to that rapid transit in their neighborhoods? And are we providing workforce housing in those spaces? And so I took a walking tour of First Hill today. And I learned a lot about how most luxury developers in that area are choosing to pay into MHA rather than have affordable units in the developments they're building, which means our hospital workers on First Hill probably cannot afford to live near the hospital that they work at. And I don't think it's any secret that HALA and MHA as policies are not necessarily working to deliver the affordable housing in the areas where density is happening that we're wanting, and certainly not happening at the pace that it needs to. And so really considering an evolution of our policies, and rather than a grand bargain with the private market, we need to be pushing our incentives and our zoning towards meeting the needs of workers. And to bring it back to your question around environment, meeting the needs of workers around the areas where they work will significantly decrease the amount of driving in our city. The fact that so many of our workers who come in are having to drive from either very far on the outside of the city or don't live in the city at all is a huge part of the contributor. And so density, transportation, workforce housing are going to be key to that. And I don't want to pretend like that's going to happen and all that's going to happen in 4 years. It's absolutely not. But the Comprehensive Plan 2024 is a really important milestone for how we set the vision for what development continues to look like in our region.
And a follow-up on that from Cole, was curious how you would encourage more permanent supportive housing and affordable housing. You know, what specifically is the best way to kind of get that production up? And you know, some of that relates to your answer with MHA, but there may be other stuff beyond that.
Yeah, so a few things. Another thing I learned today on the First Hill walk, which I had heard quite a bit about in other areas of the city that have taken on density, is there are incentives offered to developers to build parks. And parks are key to building livable areas. I think we should be asking for more when we're giving them incentives to build buildings. If you want to build taller, then we're going to have a requirement of affordable units in that building, rather than giving private developers so many options. When they're building condos in areas, I think that they're always going to choose the option that makes them the most money in the end, which is likely going to not be the direction that gets us more affordable units and the buildings that are already being built in the private market. So as we're negotiating incentives, we really should be thinking about, are we achieving our biggest goal to address our biggest crisis right now, which is the housing affordability crisis. Additionally, working with community groups. So I'm very fortunate to be working on the Youth Achievement Center as a part of my role as executive director at Creative Justice, where we have been able to work with Sound Transit to have 2 parcels in the South End next to the Columbia City Light Rail Station transferred into community care through the Africatown Community Land Trust to build affordable housing units specifically for youth of color living in the South End who would otherwise be displaced. And I think that this is a very important model that is evolving, is entrusting public land into community care and then providing the actual technical and capital support needed to complete that project. So that project is going to cost about $30 million. And you know, whether it's through the various funding options, through different types of, you know, federal funds, state funds, city funds, some of which have different requirements that may or may not allow you to build office space or a daycare, or will let you build affordable units or won't let you build affordable units. How are we supporting community and navigating the complexities of building affordable housing so that they can increase the amount of affordable housing they have? So I think really supporting our co-ops, our community land trust, and navigating those waters through the use of public lands is really important. And then the city just needs to get into building green, social, affordable housing. There is no way around the city needing to build housing. And we have public land that we could be building on. We have spaces that we could we have lots that we could be preserving affordable housing. So I think it's twofold: preserve the current units that exist. And there are some buildings on First Hill that are not buildings that in an earthquake would be safe to live in, but they are currently affordable units, but we relegate people to living in buildings we know aren't safe. So how are we making sure those buildings are safe and affordable? So preserving our current supply of affordable units while making the large investments. We know we need $400 million a year for the next 10 years, $1 billion in our region to get out of the crisis. We could be increasing the Jumpstart tax. The Progressive Revenue Task Force has identified many taxes, and we just put out a platform today on progressive revenue generation that we can use specifically to generate revenue for building housing. And I think that's what's going to have to happen is we're going to have to commit ourselves in revenue to building housing with a goal over the next 10 years. And the last piece of this is we are moving into a time where the King County Regional Homelessness Authority will play a significant role in our strategy around addressing the homelessness crisis, not just as it relates to services and contracts, but also the building and development of permanent supportive housing and bridge housing. And so what I've been told by the Regional Homelessness Authority is they need about $120 to $140 million a year of buy-in from the city of Seattle as a commitment to a regional strategy. And so I think it is, it's multifaceted. Sorry, I have a lot of young people in this building. It is multifaceted in addressing the needs, but it's not going to happen overnight. And so, yes, I hope that was an answer to your question. There's just so many moving parts.
And we're getting some good discussion in the chat. So I wanted to ask one follow-up that seemed pertinent in case you had more to say. What kind of policies do you think make a difference for stopping displacement, gentrification? When we build more housing areas, how do we avoid doing that? That's from Nicole.
Yeah. So I want to start first by acknowledging that there are communities that have really piloted good policies around this work. Folks like the Rainier Beach Action Coalition, Puget Sound Sage, Africatown Community Land Trust. And I think it's important to acknowledge when good policy comes from the grassroots. I think we tend to think electeds need to come up with all of the ideas, and sometimes electeds just need to shut up and listen and allow communities to direct. And so there's been a really great report that was put out by, say, Puget Sound Sage and Rainier Beach Action Coalition about fighting back disaster gentrification specifically, which is where people lose their homes or their property and developers come in and buy it very cheap. And they have provided some really good supports around that. When we think about anti-displacement strategies, one piece of this is preserving the naturally occurring affordable housing, and doing so in such a way that that housing is quality. One of the things that was very striking to me walking through First Hill was that the affordable units in the area, if there was an earthquake, would probably collapse, and that they're also the oldest units in the space. That says something to me about how we value people's human lives based on economics. And so really thinking about, in a space, are we ensuring that everyone has access to humane, dignified, quality, safe housing as we're preserving units or wanting to keep affordable units online? The second is working closely with community organizations like the Africatown Community Land Trust. And they're really pushing in the Central District as new developments come online. Again, this incentive piece that rather than just giving developers lots of opportunity to build higher without an equitable return on that opportunity, really does push people out of the neighborhood. So asking for more when we are giving in exchange for things is going to be key to that. The strategy of placing land in community care, working with co-ops, whether that's tenants and renters, helping them buy their buildings, or that's working with organizations like ACLT. And I keep bringing up ACLT because they're one of very few that exist. So the other side of that coin is, how are we helping other communities develop either PDAs or community land trusts to be able to navigate preserving their own spaces and their neighborhoods? The Economic Development Initiative has the potential of being a huge part of that, but it is a woefully underfunded program or part of what Seattle is currently doing in terms of a line item in the budget. So increasing our investment in EDI and then making sure that those actual dollars are moving into community. And then really thinking about what are we doing for small business and arts and culture incubation in neighborhoods where we are seeing high amounts of displacement and gentrification. I think the Central District is a great example of a place that we've done it not quite right, where we will put up lots of murals of Black and brown people. We will name buildings after Black artists. We might even, create some space for communities to have festivals or do events, but we're not actually creating space for the artists and the cultural workers that made that neighborhood viable to be able to live there. So I'm thinking about things like industrial community kitchens, where community chefs and kitchens can continue to develop. We only have Hood Famous because Sharon and Gio were able to work first out of a shared industrial space, which eventually turned into what we know as Hood Famous, and having 2 shops in our city. And so how can we build on that model for communities that are being rapidly gentrified? And the Mount Baker Artist Lofts are an example of creating affordable housing specifically for our artists, and building more opportunities like that in neighborhoods so artists can stay in the places that they have made culturally popular and viable, and really thinking specifically about affordable housing and piloting a universal basic income. Because a part of this is about zoning, part of this is about policies, but also a part of this is about access to the actual economic boom that is happening in our region. And not everyone's getting access to that. And our arts and cultural workers are really some of the most overexploited and forgotten folks in our neighborhoods. So what are we doing to pilot for their financial well-being, in addition to the many strategies that we can learn from around ending or preventing disaster gentrification? SAGE has asked for a commitment from electeds to put in place policies to prevent predatory developers from coming to people's homes and soliciting to buy their properties or force them into selling their properties. And so I'm committed to also pushing back against predatory development in policy, in order to protect neighborhoods that might be preyed upon. Lastly, HB 1410, for many of our seniors that are in their homes, could be a game changer to make sure that you don't lose your home because you haven't paid property taxes. And making sure that people know about this change in state law is a part of the political education of helping people just keep their homes, stay in their homes, is a big part of pushing back against gentrification.
Thank you for that. And I selfishly, Gio is really good at making desserts and running a famous. I selfishly want the Blue Scholars to get back together. So I don't know if those things are in conflict or not, but I want another album drop. Anyways, aside, there was a good question from Angie early in the thread, and I want to ask that before I forget about it. What are one of the first piece of legislation you'd like to introduce, revise, or repeal during your first year in office?
It's a great question. You're asking me the really hard questions on a Tuesday. I cannot tell you entirely the first thing I'd want to drop in January of 2022. But what I can tell you is what I'm excited about working on. I am very excited about land use and zoning, which I think is shocking to a lot of people, but I see a lot of promise and opportunity to do things better. Or I see a lot of possibility of doing things in a really messed up way. And so as we move into hopefully off of the work that Councilmember Mosqueda has already started in pursuing neighborhood residential, that we can really start to create the capacity throughout the city to build more density in an equitable and just way, and really leverage our zoning code, not just for building affordable housing, but there's also opportunities around zoning and permitting to push developers, depending on what type of development it is, to have a unionized workforce or be committed to certain community benefits. And these are all really important parts of making sure that the development that is happening in our city doesn't displace people, but actually adds to the benefit of the people that are currently living there and creates opportunity for people to come back. So I'm really excited to do land use and zoning work from a place of not just racial equity, but hopefully justice and reparations, and really thinking it like from the ground up, how are we building things better, more sustainably, and in a way that actually addresses the historical harms that have occurred, are areas that I really want to dig into. And the urbanist community would be a community I would want to continue to pursue that work with. Also thinking about issues around design review and the master permitting process, and how for things like affordable housing, we might be seeing delays that are incredibly unnecessary and also very expensive. It's hard to build if you're going to make money off of it. It's even harder to build when you know you won't make money off of it. And those delays really add to the cost, and have not just an economic cost, but they have a life cost on our relatives who do not have access to quality, affordable housing yet.
That's awesome, and thank you for that. I suppose I can do a little pivot now. All this housing talk is awesome, but I also wanted to ask about defund, because that's kind of how some folks maybe got reintroduced to you this past summer when you were active in that, and we're at the kind of famous rally at the city hall where Mayor Dickin came out, and you know, that kind of was a turning point potentially. But I'm curious how it's going on the campaign trail, because there's sort of this conventional wisdom that it's an unpopular policy. Are you finding on the campaign trail that's the case? And what are you finding as far as when people are on the fence? Are they movable? What kind of is convincing to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I just want to say, I actually see the work around land use and zoning as deeply connected to the work we're doing around policing. The color of law really breaks down the ways in which how our city has been constructed, also contributes to the reasons why certain neighborhoods are over policed. And so I'm really excited about finding ways to undo root causes, which is ultimately what Defund the Police is about. It is about acknowledging that our current public safety system is woefully ineffective at delivering on its promise of public safety. And it has a lot to do with the way in which our city is constructed, whether we're talking about where people live geographically and what they do or don't have access to, the way those different geographies are treated, or the types of budgetary investments that do or do not get made into certain communities. We have generated a scenario where people in our city feel like they have to be reliant upon someone with a gun and a badge as an enforcement mechanism to deal with social issues that are really, at the end of the day, about meeting people's basic needs. That is the most effective way of generating safety for everyone. If everyone in our city were to have access to safe housing, healthcare, economic and educational opportunity when they need and want it, were to have access to behavioral health support, so whether we're talking about mental health or drug use, making sure that people have access to these basic things that make it so a human being can sustain, we would just naturally see a safer city. What I am finding throughout the campaign is that if you take enough time to talk with someone about what Defund's actual goal is around creating a public health and safety system that works for everyone, people eventually start to make their own logical leap towards, oh, right, it would be much better to prevent harm rather than simply react to it. And our current public safety system is not doing that. Police don't prevent harm. And in fact, by studies done that the city asked for, 50% of the calls that come into 911 should not be responded by police. They should actually be responded to by some other type of professional that has a different type of expertise. And within that other 50%, there's a majority of those calls that need something like a mental health expert or behavioral health expert, or need someone who can help get a survivor of domestic violence into a new housing situation. Housing, according to most survivor networks, is the most important factor in getting a person in a domestic violence situation into a safer place. And typically, many survivors would ask for that over dealing with a court system that tends to re-traumatize them. So I think that there is a lot of well-intended and good faith interest in better understanding what the goals are of defund the police, and the opportunity to talk about building a public health and safety system that works for everyone, that is not racially disproportionate, that actually responds to people's needs. Most people are open and responsive to, and I think the election results that have Nicole Thomas Kennedy and myself both in the first place in our primary shows that there is at least over 40% of the city that is also ready to have that conversation. The other part of this, I think, is there are a lot of folks who, when you start to talk about basic needs, what actually generates safety, that are responsive to that and who are willing to engage in the idea of a city that really does treat housing like a human right. And so that's, for me, where I see the work we're doing around divestment and investment, the work we're doing around land use and zoning, and the work we're doing around rapidly building affordable housing. These are actually deeply interconnected things, and learning how to talk about them in a way that shows that getting someone sustainably housed makes everyone on this call and everyone in our city safer. It is a really important connection to be making for the city. And I'm finding in a lot of conversations, people are actually willing to engage that, and are starting to see that housing for all is really not that radical, and investing in a public safety system that is truly effective, it actually delivers on its promise of safety, is also not that radical.
Yeah, exactly. Another surprise, not directly from the primary, but shortly thereafter, was Compassion Seattle getting struck down from the ballot. It still does seem like there is a lot of energy, or that's still homelessness is still a top issue according to polls. I'm curious what you think, of this whole situation. What will come after Compassion Seattle, if it's sort of going to happen anyways via the candidates who support it, or what is a good alternative? All of that. Sorry, it's kind of a messy question, but it is kind of a messy issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think reality is Compassion Seattle was an unfunded mandate that ultimately was going to be bad policy in terms of it being how it was implemented. 2,000 units in a year probably meant that they were majority going to be emergency shelter. And we know that emergency shelter is not a real root response to the crisis. I think the Compassion Seattle Charter Amendment also really did not fund any additional services. I think it was about 1% more than what the city was already funding. So it really did not drive us in a direction of responding with budgetary resources that are commensurate with the crisis that's in front of us. And I think that's really important to break down, to help people understand that charter amendment, didn't just fail because of a legal issue, though that is what took it off the ballot. But ultimately, it wasn't going to drive us closer to getting out of the crisis. But what will? And this is, again, where I think the charter amendment would have gotten in the way. We as a region have decided to invest, and the city is committed to, in the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. And the charter amendment and the Regional Homelessness Authority, in many ways, we're going to be in conflict in terms of the Regional Homelessness Authority getting to develop a regional strategy that multiple municipalities, hopefully multiple, because right now it's King County and Seattle, will be invested in a regional response to homelessness. That being said, I think continuing with the leadership of folks like the Lived Experience Coalition, with members of the House Our Neighbors Coalition, leading the way on what our next steps are is going to be really important. The city spends a lot of time trying to generate policy without talking to the people whose lives and material conditions it's going to impact most. And our neighbors without homes are quite knowledgeable about what they need in order to transition from one phase to the next. Something that I think is really important is if we look at our current shelter system, including tiny house villages and hotels, there is a very low rate of folks actually getting into permanent or transitional housing, which means we're doing something wrong at getting folks connected to the next step on their journey out of homelessness. Every time we get someone into shelter, it should lead to the next thing away from living outside. And we're not doing that now. A lot of what we're hearing is our supports are not low barrier. There are bottlenecks to getting access to those supports. Our workers are overwhelmed. They're underpaid, overwhelmed, and don't have access to the right resources. And we do not have alignment of strategy throughout the city. So I am excited about the potential of the collaboration with the King County Regional Homelessness Authority to, in partnership with our residents who are living outside, really developing a solid strategy. I am also very excited about the House Our Neighbors Coalition, because without that coalition, no one would have thought twice about challenging Charter Amendment 29. And that coalition really led the way. And I know that they are making plans in the future to continue figuring out how those with lived experience and those who are on the front lines of providing direct support could actually be at the front of developing our strategies around responding to the crisis. That being said, there is no replacement for just building housing. And I think the city has really shirked its duty on building housing, whether that's looking at our bonding capacity, progressive revenue generation, or better investing the dollars we have now, better fiscal management. We have a responsibility to just get into building green, social, affordable housing. And we should have done it in 2015. Imagine how much housing we would have had built in 6 years. And since we didn't, we should start today.
Yes, that would be so awesome. Sign me up. I want to, another big issue, and we got a question in on this, and Ryan Packer reported on this, and they got their hands on an SDOT report that shows a troubling trend as far as pedestrian deaths and traffic deaths in general, which are on an upward trend, and we're supposedly going to end them by 2030. And that's our Vision Zero goal we made in 2015 under the Murray administration. Just a statewide goal, similar problem in the state. But how do we improve the city's response to those fatalities and injuries and make our streets safer?
Yeah, I think one thing is for the city to pretend like we don't know where there are unsafe streets would be really problematic. We know some areas that already are high traffic or high speed zones, or that lack appropriate barriers or safety. And those are areas we should start in. So really thinking about Aurora, and groups like Reimagine Aurora have already made considerable recommendations to the city to take action on. And I think it's important that as we think about the Move Seattle dollars through the levy that'll be renewed, as we think about the infrastructure dollars that'll likely come down from the federal government, that we actually invest those dollars in the areas we know have the most marginalized and vulnerable populations, and in the areas we know have the highest need for safety. So really looking for that intersection, which is, I don't think that's the way that we have done road safety. We've often prioritized the neighborhoods that can get closest to city government, If you look at the South End, and how things like bike lanes have or have not unfolded, how sidewalks or curb cutouts have or have not unfolded, and then look at other areas of the city. Look at whose projects in Move Seattle have been put on pause and whose have not. There is a huge equity gap, and they often correlate with the neighborhoods that do have the most marginalized and vulnerable residents. So I think one really important thing is just turning that paradigm upside down. There are obviously the actual changes to streets, the changing the arterials, changing the speed, are all a really, really important part of that. But I think how we prioritize those projects has to shift. And then a real commitment to actually spend the dollars. We see this a lot with Seattle. We might put a levy in place, and then we don't spend the dollars in the way we said we would, or we reprioritize, not just because there's been a fiscal loss, but because we decided we want to do something different. And there's usually no accountability or transparency around how that happens. So I think the other thing is, as we move into probably renewing the Move Seattle levy, we need a real report about why certain projects didn't happen, so that voters can have trust in voting honestly for another regressive tax for things that the city has been promising for many, many years. And then the last thing I will say is the Stay Healthy Streets, I think present a real opportunity to continue to create road safety. One of the struggles there is there's still a lot of multimodality that includes cars. And so if we're gonna commit to Stay Healthy Streets, we should probably really commit to them, and make the streets that we're committed to being streets for walking, biking, rolling, be just that and not be multimodal if we're really committed to street safety and being healthy in those areas.
Totally. Also related in transportation, you've been an advocate for free transit, and I was curious how you would kind of go about rolling that out, and also being cognizant of wanting transit quality to go up as well in much of the city. So meeting those two goals.
So a few things. During the pandemic, we found ways to not ticket people for parking, and the city didn't collapse. We found ways to make free transit, and the city did not collapse. But what we did have to do was reprioritize how we do our spending in the budget. And so I think our city budget is more than a policy document. It is a moral statement about who and what we value. And so in our contracting with King County Metro, really considering what our financial investment is in providing free transit throughout the service or throughout the city, and really thinking about things like feeder buses or east-west access, because it would be one thing to make transit free, but then for folks on Aurora who are trying to travel east-west, or up in North Seattle that want to travel east-west and cannot, it still does not make transit accessible. And so I think there will have to be some reworking of the way we think, in particular about our King County Metro bus system and our relationship as a city to contracting with King County for those services. This does come down to things like revenue. Free transit means we can stop fare enforcement. So there is, we don't make a lot of money off of transit. In fact, I don't think we make any. It might be one of the few things, whether it's the county or the city level, that it doesn't necessarily generate a huge return. And so to make fiscal arguments around people paying the fare is really problematic. But thinking about congestion pricing is one option, which could be an incredibly inequitable tax. And so I think it would require some analysis around whether or not that would generate the kind of revenue that really allows us to provide not just free transit, but rapid, high quality transit that has the various links and connections that it needs to be usable. And can we do that in an equitable way? There is the possibility at the state level of us trying to move a bill again to be able to have the regional authority to build out our system and tax for that system in a way that really does meet our needs. And then there's just delivering on things like the various sound transit packages well. And I was really excited to read the Urbanist article today about our streetcars and how could we actually make them effective and useful, you know, thinking about the Central District, thinking about moving down into Belltown. But it's not going to happen overnight. It does require funding. I don't think it's an impossibility. We did it during a pandemic, though service was arguably not as good as we want it to be. It definitely was on like holiday hours quite frequently. But the potential does exist. And at the end of the day, for me, our budget does say who and what we value. And if we're saying that transit is one of our key ways of getting out of the climate catastrophe, and by having access to rapid, affordable transit, we will allow families to get out of their vehicles. It is a commitment we're going to need to financially buy into.
Really, and Nicole has a really great question that we're kind of keep on being right around that. So it's a good time to ask it. And a lot of Seattle politicians, you know, they're for progressive tax reform, but then sometimes they can't always name a tax that they're for. You're definitely not of that mold, but I'm curious what you thought, if you have more thoughts on what kind of progressive revenue generation the city can do, given our constitutional barriers that Nicole referenced. And for folks who have been following it, that includes the state technically as forbidden income taxes, except for a flat 1% income tax that the Seattle won in an appeal, but lost the former Trump-proof tax. A little backstory there, but I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that is, yes, the income tax is not a perfect solution and would require a plan around the rebate, but it's not the only tax we have an option for, actually. There's quite a few, and I just dropped the link to our new platform that we released. It is a progressive revenue menu. Look at the need, look at the solution, and there are actually a lot of options. Now, they're not going to generate like Jumpstart will a potential. I mean, Jumpstart could generate $500 million a year if we were to raise the percentage of the payroll-based tax. That being said, we could do a local estate inheritance tax, an excessive CEO pay tax. We can raise the REIT. We have a lot of options around thinking about developer impact fees, a wealth tax, and a city level capital gains tax. These are all options that are in front of us. I think the reasons politicians argue against them once they get into office is they don't make you politically loved by the folks who pay for you to get elected. And I think the benefit of our campaign is we have well over 5,000 contributors, most of whom are not your wealthiest folks in Seattle. And that's who I view myself accountable to, is the folks who are paying the most in taxes right now. While the wealthiest pay somewhere between 0 to 2% in our state, some of our most tax burdened residents are paying 17%, who are also those who are most impacted by the racial wealth gap, most impacted by the lack of access to affordable housing. So I think it is our mandate to pursue the options that have been laid out for us by our own progressive revenue task force. Like, I didn't even have to come up with half of these taxes. The city already knows that we can do them, and have already been told by legal that they're possible. Now there's some technicalities to figure out on them. And I think that anytime we're trying to pass progressive revenue generation options, we're gonna face lawsuits. And I think that's the number one reason why most electeds don't want to push for progressive tax generating options, is they don't wanna fight the lawsuit. And I think those are just fights we're gonna have to have. Not only does it burden our most taxed residents, but it also puts us in an economic system where, because we're dependent upon regressive taxes, anytime there's a recession, we're going to find ourselves in the situation we're in. So if we want a more resilient resilient ways to generate revenue, a more resilient budget, it will be through progressive taxes. So I'm committed to that. I've met with folks like Tammy Morales, Teresa Mosqueda, who are also committed to it. And I think that by building a council that has, Shama Sawant, Morales, Mosqueda, myself on it, we will have a considerable amount of political will to do what I think there is already will in the community, especially from those that are most tax burdened, to see happen.
And speaking of generating progressive revenue, I wanted to, you dropped the website in there. I believe you already hit your democracy vouchers limit. Is that correct? Can people still give you democracy vouchers?
You cannot give us democracy vouchers any longer.
No.
We hit our limit in June, which is amazing. We entered the general election and received a really fat check to keep campaigning. So thank you to all of you who contributed to the democracy voucher program. I believe probably with your taxes. And so we cannot, but I would recommend, look at other races with candidates that you think reflect the same values within Seattle, and would encourage you to, give your democracy vouchers to them.
And you still take cash, right? Cash donations?
We cannot for now.
Okay, so your budget is your budget.
Yeah, I mean, if Sarah Nelson reaches the cap again, so if she raises above the amount that we were allowed to receive, then we are able to ask for our cap to be released, and we may be able to then receive cash donations again. So that potential does exist. It happened in the primary. It will probably happen in the general. I don't know how many of y'all read the Public Disclosure Commission often. I do. Sarah Nelson's receiving almost consistently across the board $550 from every single contributor, and has far less contributors than our campaign does. So I get the feeling that she will reach that cap, and then we'll be able to, once again together keep raising donations to get through the finish line.
So for now, people can definitely volunteer if they're interested, since for now, money is got to be on the sideline until the cap is hit. Anyone in particular should reach out, just sign up on the website, maybe, if they'd like to canvass or call.
Yeah, let me drop the volunteer page. So we have a new website. Here's the link to sign up for volunteers. And here's also the link to our events. We are doing a number of community listening posts. During the general community listening post is a participatory policymaking session. We're launching our first one this Friday on cannabis equity, and really thinking about how can we do better by the communities that were brutalized by the drug war, the workers that are currently in the cannabis industry, and what does equity look like? We're doing an environmental and climate justice community listening post, public health and public safety. Our youth team is leading a listening post on Monday at Pratt Park. So a lot of opportunities to volunteer as note takers, facilitators, or to come out and door knock. If that's your jam, cold calling and talking to voters.
Awesome. And the Urbanist, I believe, is co-sponsoring at least one of those listening sessions. I got to get that up on the website. But yeah, we're excited for that. It's a really, unique way of doing campaigning. I think the grassroots really shines through.
Yeah, I mean, we've had such beautiful canvases with sometimes 100 people up in Wedgwood, where you would think, we may not be the campaign folks want to come out for, but I think we're really seeing some major shifts in the city, and very excited by the turnout at our canvases.
All right, well, we're right at the buzzer at 7:30 here. We're wrapping up. Thanks so much for joining us, Nikkita, and finding the time, and best of luck in the campaign. Thanks everyone for joining.